I need to just say, as we get started, how happy I am to be here with you today. This is now the fifth time that I've tried to record this podcast episode for you. We're talking about people pleasing today. I'm very excited about this topic, and I think that it's a topic that's going to really connect with a lot of you. And it has taken me so long to get here right now to talk with you. I tried to record so many times last week, and I would hit record, and all of a sudden, this gigantic truck would come like rolling down our street, chopping down trees. Like it was wild, the excessive amount of background noise. Then I tried again, and all of a sudden, my neighbor was doing like aggressive lawn work. There were leaf blowers. It sounded like there was some sort of drill going on. And then finally, I recorded the entire episode for you. I was so excited. I'm like, hallelujah, it is done. And I went to listen to the playback, and I literally sounded like Chewbacca. My mic somehow wasn't connecting with Zoom. And that's where I record these episodes for you. And it was just such a disaster. And I just had to wave the flag of surrender and say, we're going to try again next week. It's officially next week. Next week is now. I'm here with you. I'm so happy to be here with you today. You have no idea. Like I said, we're talking about people pleasing. I got a great question from one of our listeners who asked, how do you navigate people pleasing? As a recovering people pleaser, I find it still haunts me. Curious how you did this work on yourself and how you help your clients also. As we start this conversation about people pleasing, I want to say that I relate to feeling like a recovering people pleaser. Actively people pleasing was how I lived in my life for, I mean, really the majority of it. As long as I can remember, thinking back to like, teenage years, adolescence, it was so present with me. And so everything that I share in this episode, I share with a lot of compassion, and also it, it's deeply relatable to me. I think there's three things that we must understand about people pleasing as we go into this conversation, but also if we want to experience our relationships differently. First, I consider people pleasing a form of perfectionism. You're always trying to say the perfect words, show up in the perfect way, make everyone feel perfectly happy. In my mind, in my eyes, from my perspective, it is a form of perfectionism. It is also the second thing is that it is a coping mechanism that we develop for self protection and preservation. At the root of people pleasing is the desire for safety, right? The desire for safety in our relationships, uh, acceptance, love. There is a desire for safety at the root, at the core of people pleasing. And it is the coping mechanism that was developed to create self protection and preservation. We always want to look at the positive intention beneath any of our behavior. I firmly believe that there's always a positive intention, and connecting with that positive intention can be really powerful. One, just to bring deeper self-awareness so that you understand yourself more, but also so that you can understand yourself through a lens of self-compassion rather than self-judgment. And if self-compassion is something that you are working on, I think it is very, very valuable when we're doing work around people pleasing. I have an entire episode on self-compassion. I believe it's episode 3 of the podcast, but it's an early on solo episode all about self-compassion. I would really encourage you to check out that episode. But this is the second thing that we have to understand. It is a coping mechanism developed for self-protection or preservation. And the third thing that I think is really, really important for people pleasers to understand about ourselves, right? And I put myself in this category because I spent so many years people pleasing, and I had to understand this about myself as well to be able to move forward. It doesn't mean that you are more kind or caring than everyone else in the room. My experience has been that many people pleasers use this as a way to really justify their behavior, right? It's like, well, this is my personality. I'm the kindest one. I'm the most caring one. It becomes almost like it's who you are. People pleasing is not who you are. It is not a personality. It's not an identity. No form of perfectionism is, right? People pleasing is a form of perfectionism. And and uh and perfectionism is not who you are. It's not your identity. Again, it's a coping mechanism that you've developed for self-protection and preservation. So people pleasing doesn't mean that you are more kind or caring than everyone else in the room. And in fact, and I say this with so much compassion for you, for the part of you that is trying to self protect. But what actually happens when we people please is that we try to self protect by controlling how people perceive us in our relationships, right? We are trying to control and manipulate the way that people perceive us, the way that people experience us through trying to always say, do, and be perfectly pleasing to them. So I want to free you from the idea that this is who you are or that this is your identity. It is not. It is a coping mechanism. And so you do not have to carry around the weight of, I always have to be the kindest, most caring person in the room. In fact, people pleasing is actually a controlling and even somewhat manipulative way to be in a relationship. Again, I say this with compassion and I say this with the understanding of the positive intention behind it. And I think this is such a valuable, important thing for us to understand about people pleasing if we want to experience our relationships differently. So, in an effort to push the pain of rejection and abandonment like far, far away, right? It's like, oh, I never want to experience rejection. I never want to experience abandonment. I never want to experience someone's disappointment in me. I want to avoid the pain of that at all costs. I want to put that where I never, ever have to experience it again. We start people pleasing, but people pleasing creates a different kind of pain because when you are people pleasing, you are hiding your true, imperfect human self. This is true with all forms of perfectionism, okay? People pleasing being one of them. You hide your true, imperfect, human, amazing self to avoid the rejection or the abandonment or, disappointing other people. But then you end up feeling like nobody really like knows you or sees you and maybe even like truly loves you, right? Because they don't know the whole real you. And so then instead of rejection, abandonment, or disappointment, we experience the pain of disconnection, resentment, and loneliness. It is very, very, very common for people pleasers. And I say that I'm using the term people pleasers not as your true identity, right? But like a way of being in relationships. And so when I say that, just know I'm not saying that that is who you are, that is your identity. But when we are people pleasing, it's very common to experience feelings of disconnection from other people. It's probably even more common to experience resentment. And it's very common to feel lonely, even in our closest relationships, because we're not really letting people in, right? We're putting on an act. There's a facade there. We are trying to be who we think that this other person wants us to be in that moment. I cannot tell you the number of women who've shared with me that they feel like they are like an actor in their life, right? They are constantly acting in the way that they believe that they should, and they're not being who they truly are. When we are people pleasing, we are so hyper vigilant in our relationships, right? We're hyper vigilant trying to avoid that pain of rejection, abandonment, disappointment, right? We're hyper vigilant with this coping mechanism, but it ends up really feeling like it runs our lives. It's very hard to experience like deep, authentic connection in relationships. Maybe even like impossible to experience that deep down authentic connection in relationships when we are people pleasing. Again, because rather than showing up as ourselves, as our true, wonderful, imperfect human selves, we're showing up as this version of ourselves that we think the other people wants, needs, expects, right? In that moment. And I think it's really important to reflect on how does that feel for you? There was probably a time in your life where the coping mechanism of people pleasing really served you. Maybe it was what you really needed at a time earlier on in your life. But if you're here listening to this episode and you're like, oh, I want to experience my relationships differently, then we know that this coping mechanism is no longer serving you, right? It's no longer feeling supportive. And sometimes a coping mechanism that we feel we really need at an earlier on time of our lives, like maybe in childhood or adolescence, or in like a certain dysfunctional relationship, whatever it might be, then that's how we end up showing up like far into the future, even though it's no longer serving us. And so we always want to practice gratitude for the part of ourself who needed to develop this coping mechanism. Like, thank you for doing what you thought you needed to do to keep me safe. And I want to learn how to do it differently. And so, as we talk about getting to that place where it's like, I really want to learn how to do this differently, check in with yourself. How does it feel to people please in your relationship? Does it feel lonely? Are you resentful? Do you feel disconnected even in your closest relationships, and definitely in your relationship with yourself, right? If you're constantly showing up as a reaction to what other people, what you perceive other people need you to be, then you're disconnecting from what you need and who you are in that moment. So, how does it feel? When we talk about experiencing our relationships differently, there's always going to be a combination of different types of work. There's going to be mindset work, right? Like, what is going on in your mind? What are the stories that you're telling yourself? What are the thoughts that you're repeating? What does your inner dialogue sound like? And that's where that self compassion episode is going to be really powerful for you. So, what is going on in your mind, right? There's always going to be nervous system regulation work. We're always going to be thinking about regulating the nervous system because, like I said, this is a coping mechanism developed for self protection and preservation. That means at the core of this is safety. When we feel safe, that is a different nervous system experience than when we do not feel safe, when we feel like our safety is in jeopardy, right? And so we're always going to want to be weaving in. I think of it as a spider web, right? It's like all these things are interplaying together. They're, the lines are crossing and they're really working together to create this beautiful spider web. One part of that is the mindset work. And of course, there's layers of that. Like I just rattled off a couple of those layers. There's nervous system regulation work, making sure that you feel grounded in who you are so that you can respond appropriately in situations and so that you can feel an internal sense of safety when that is available to you. So nervous system regulation work. And then the third really core piece of this spider web that I see when we're talking about people pleasing is aligned action. And when I say aligned action, I mean that you show up in your life, your actions that you take in your life are aligned with who you are, with your core values, and with how you want to show up and experience your life, right? And when we talk about aligned action, there are things that need to happen in order for us to get to a place to take aligned action. It's not that we just sit here and say, I want to experience my relationships differently. I'm going to start taking aligned action today. Because if you've been people pleasing for a large portion of your life, if you've been disconnecting from yourself and showing up in reaction to what you think other people want or need you to be, basically like acting in your life, you may not understand what you want or what you need or what your core values are. You might not be connected to yourself, right? I think the biggest disconnection we experience in people pleasing is disconnection from ourselves. And so when we talk about taking aligned action, what we're really talking about there is reconnecting with yourself. What are you feeling? What do you want? What do you need? Who are you? What are your core values? And that can take some time and that can take some experimenting. Our relationship with ourself is like a relationship with anyone else. You want to have a close relationship, you want to have like a close, deep relationship. There needs to be communication. There needs to be curiosity. There needs to be compassion. There needs to be grace. There needs to be quality time. And there needs to be a building of trust that happens over time. And the more that you do that inner work with yourself, along with, the mindset stuff that we talked about, the nervous system regulation, you can see how this is all a spider web. The more that you're able to then show up in the world and say, like, oh, I'm going to take an action. And this feels aligned with who I truly am, or who I am to the best of my knowledge in this moment, right? We can only do the best that we can with what we know in each moment. And the more that you get to know yourself, the more clear aligned actions are going to become to you. And that might be an aligned action in your relationship with yourself. It might be an aligned action in your relationship with someone else. But you're going to build up that trust with yourself. And then you're going to be able to build up that trust in your relationship with other people. And as you're offering yourself more compassion, and as you're offering yourself more grace, and as you're connecting more deeply with what you want and what you need and what you feel, you're actually going to be able to do that more with the people in your life, not in a way where you feel like you're acting or trying to be who they want or need, but you shift from reaction to really being present and being able to respond more organically, more naturally, in those moments with other people. So, when we talk about experiencing our relationships differently and we are people pleasing, I always think it's valuable to almost like step outside of ourselves and imagine that we're watching this, like play out from like a different vantage point, right? Like imagine that you can watch this play out. And then imagine that you can actually jump back into the scenario, but in the other person, from the other person's perspective. And think about how it would feel for them to know that you are not really being like honest about who you are in that moment or what you need or what you like, but you're just trying to do and be what you think they want you to be. Like, really genuinely ask yourself, like, how do you think that would feel if it was like, let's say one of your close friends and she found out that every time she asked you, like, well, where do you want to go to dinner? What do you want to do tonight? And you were like, well, I don't care, whatever you want. And actually, like, you wanted sushi or you wanted pizza, or you were like totally exhausted from the week. And what you actually needed was a night in, but you like forced yourself to go out and be social, even though you really didn't want to be there. Like, imagine what it would feel like for the person on the other side of this relationship to know that that was going on internally for you and they were experiencing you in like a way that was different than what was true for you inside. And I think when we really understand that, we can see that showing up as our imperfect, amazing, wonderful human self in our relationship, while it might not be so quote unquote perfect, that it actually helps us to have deeper connection. And of course, when we move away from people pleasing as the primary way that we show up in our relationships and we show up more authentically, there may, I don't want to say there may be relationships that will change. All of our relationships will change. And that can be really scary, especially for a people pleaser. But all of our relationships are going to change. Some relationships may there may become natural distance in those relationships, or there may be some people who no longer want to spend time with you if you're not people pleasing all the time, perhaps, right? Or there may need to be some relationship adjustments where you're kind of um redefining like what's expected in those relationships, redefining those expectations, redefining the like, for lack of a better word, like the vibe between you and that other person, right? If you're sharing more of your actual opinions or what you need, or you know, that dynamic is shifting, like the vibe or the energy in those relationships might change. Um, this is not all negative. Actually, I would say none of it is negative, right? It is creating more alignment in your relationships. What I want to share with you that I think is so exciting and wonderful is that many of your relationships will get better. There will be deeper connection and more intimacy in your relationships when you get to show up as who you are, right? Like that is one of the coolest things about experiencing our relationships differently after people pleasing is there will be more connection and more intimacy in many of your relationships. Also, you will experience less loneliness because you will feel really seen as who you are. You will experience less disconnection because you'll be more connected to yourself and more connected with other people. And you will experience so much less resentment because you will no longer feel like you have to be the kindest, most caring one in the room. And you won't let anyone help you because you don't want to become a burden. Because if you become a burden, then they might not want to be around you anymore. Your relationships, the ones that get stronger and become healthier and become more connected, will also become more reciprocal. When your relationships are more reciprocal, you will naturally experience less resentment. It is so amazing when this happens. So this requires, right, to move away from people pleasing as our primary way of showing up in relationships. It requires us to feel safe within ourselves, even if someone might not be perfectly happy with us, right? Even if something that we do or say might be disappointing to them. There's a whole episode with my co-host Ali Lehman, all about disappointing people. So that's a great episode to tap into around like fears with this. Even if someone might be disappointed with you, even if someone might not like you, this is this is a hard truth for people pleasers to accept, but everyone might not like you. You probably are not for everyone. I mean, how could you be? Think of all the people in the world, right? You are not for everyone. I am not for everyone, but we are for some really amazing people. And when we work on moving away from the coping mechanism of people pleasing and doing things differently in our relationships, right? When we learn the skills to be in relationships differently, the really amazing people who we are for, we get to have better relationships with those people. And it's really incredible. So, connecting with that inner feeling, that inner sense of safety. We want to understand the positive intention beneath the people pleasing, right? It was there to keep me safe. We want to work on the mindset piece. What are my recurring thoughts? What are the stories that I'm telling myself? What am I making this mean about me? One of the most valuable questions you can ask yourself, right? In an interaction with someone else, what am I making that mean about me? Your beliefs about who you are. People pleasing is not your identity. It's not who you are. It's a coping mechanism, right? And what does that inner dialogue sound like? Is your inner critic running the show here? The inner critic is loud when it comes to people pleasing, right? And again, the inner critic wants to keep us safe. That's why it's popping up. But can we start to be curious with that inner critic, and can we start to invite in the voice of self-compassion? And I walk you through more how to do this in that self-compassion episode. You've got to notice what people pleasing is holding you back from. that deep connection, right? With yourself, with other people, those meaningful reciprocal relationships, um, and that safety within. It's so important to cultivate that inner sense of safety and that inner sense of worth and value. You matter. You are worth knowing. And then you get to begin the really, I think, incredibly meaningful and actually really fun work of getting to know yourself so that you can move forward in your life, in your relationships, taking aligned action with who you are, with what matters most to you, with those personal values really guiding you, and that deep connection with yourself, with your intuition.